Hi, this is a presenter from the Academy. Today we're going to meet a Stoic philosopher, Heraclides of Tarsus. He was born in 277 BCE in a city called Tarsus, which is today known as Tars, Mersin, located on the Mediterranean coast of Turkey. His father was named Diogenes, according to some accounts, but according to others, he was named Attis. He spent time with the Cynics, the Epicureans, the Peripatetics, the major schools of philosophy of his day. And he also conversed with various philosophers about their ideas. And after many years of study, he eventually settled on Stoicism as the philosophy that best fit his thinking, and Cleanthes and attempted to update their ideas to better reflect the state of knowledge at the time of his writing. So even if Heraclides didn't write anything down himself, we can still learn about his thought by looking at the work of those who came after him. In any case, Heraclides thought that the world was full of gods and that the divine was present everywhere. If the ball rolls off the edge of the table, it doesn't fall to the ground below as a result of chance or spontaneity, but simply because that's what balls do. They follow the laws of physics, and in the same way, humans act according to their nature, which is to pursue what they want and avoid what they don't want. And since this is the nature of all human beings, this means that good and evil are determined by nature. Now, he also thought that what happens to us depends on how we think about it. In one fragment, he writes, quote, "Men think of themselves as free, but it's their habits that enslave them." And Heraclides thought that we can get our habits right by following nature. After all, our nature is to act in accordance with virtue, and thus they are able to accept what happens with equanimity. So again, this idea of what is in our control and what is not in our control is central to Stoicism. He believed that anger can be appropriate in some situations. In one letter, Pliny the Younger describes a situation where his brother was falsely accused of a crime and was facing imprisonment and torture. In one fragment, he says, quote, "The mark of the man who has overcome his passions is a tranquil and quiet spirit." And so, generally speaking, he thought that people shouldn't get upset over things that are not in their control. And it's something that Heraclides emphasized. He should get angry and rouse the whole city of Bithynia to his defense. So it seems that anger can be appropriate in some situations, but in general, Heraclides was against anger. He wasn't the founder of Stoicism, as is often mistakenly believed, nor was he the most prolific writer on Stoicism, nor the most systematic, and both of them would go on to have a significant impact on Roman Stoicism. This has been the series on Stoic philosophy. If you like this video, please hit the thumbs up button below and subscribe to our channel for more videos like this. Thanks for watching. So if you want to learn more about Roman Stoicism, you might want to start with Heraclides. But he was very influential, and he taught some of the greatest minds of his age. And to be on guard against those who are too eager to please. Later Stoics echo this sentiment, especially Marcus Aurelius, who talks about false friends in Meditations, because death is simply the return of a person to the nature from which they came. In fact, he thought that death could be beneficial for the soul, because it allowed the soul to escape from the body and all its limitations. In fact, in one fragment, he talks about the difference between the person who is wise and the person who isn't. And he says that the wise person is undisturbed by what happens, whereas the unwise person is disturbed by what happens. So if we can follow nature, we will be virtuous and we will live a good life. And in another place he says, quote, "The chief task in life is to separate things into two buckets, things that are in our control and things that aren't." In fact, he identified the divine with nature itself, with the rational order of the cosmos. Death is not something to fear. It's something that can actually be beneficial for the soul. And both Epictetus and Marcus Aurelius developed the idea of the dichotomy of control. For instance, Heraclides was familiar with the work of the astronomer Aristarchus of Samos and temperance, and that these four virtues corresponded to the four elements: fire, air, earth, and water. However, He thought that wisdom was the most important of the virtues, and he defined it as the love of wisdom and knowledge. He thought that people act according to nature, not just animals, not just inanimate objects, but people as well. And this meant that free will was an illusion. In fact, he used the metaphor of a ball rolling across a table to illustrate this point, who argued that the Earth rotates on its axis and revolves around the sun, and he probably incorporated some of these ideas into his own system. But what causes the pain is your toe being stubbed, right? That's the thing that happens from without. And you experience pain because of your disposition towards the event. You are carrying yourself a certain way, so you feel something bad about it. We don't know much about his early life, although it seems likely that he was wealthy. He probably had a comfortable life available to him. Instead, he said, quote, "Evil comes from being carried away, and this is from within, but good comes from being rightly disposed, and this is from without." And so for the Stoics, the key to dealing with evil things is to change how we respond to them, to change our disposition towards them. We can't change what happens outside of us, but we can change how we respond to what happens. What does this mean? Well, let's take an example. But instead of living a carefree existence with money, he chose a different path. He decided to leave his home city of Tarsus and travel around Greece and the East learning philosophy. In fact, he ended up being quite successful as a teacher of Stoicism. He taught in Athens for several years, and then he went to Rome in the 140s BC. We don't know how long he lived or when he died. And so this video will focus primarily on what we know about his ideas based on the fragments of his work that have survived to us and the mentions of him that we find in other ancient sources. And there he had a significant impact on the leading intellectuals of the city. The orator Cicero was one of his students, as was the philosopher Panaetius, who was very influential among the Roman Stoics as well. But sadly, our knowledge of Heraclides' life ends here. Let's begin with his views on physics. It seems like Heraclides took over the task of explaining nature from the earlier Stoics, such as Zeno. We know this because later Stoics, such as Pliny the Younger, refer back to Heraclides' ideas on these topics. He believed that everything that happens in the universe happens according to nature. This included human actions as well. Imagine a person rolling a ball across a table, he says. So for Heraclides, the Stoics who said that evil comes from within and that good comes from without were wrong. If you stub your toe, you feel pain. Now, this is an evil thing, right? You don't want to experience pain. Now, this doesn't mean that you feel pain because you choose to feel pain, but it does mean that the feeling of pain comes from within. In fact, this idea becomes central to Stoicism after Heraclides, especially with Epictetus and Marcus Aurelius. These ideas also appear elsewhere in the Stoic tradition, especially in the work of Epictetus, who says something very similar to the idea that it's our habits that enslave us. Now, one implication of this idea is that if we can get our habits right, then our life will be good. This brings us to Heraclides' ethics. He thought that there were 4 cardinal virtues: wisdom, justice, courage. He believed that the wise person has a clear understanding of what is and is not in our control. He then goes on to say that this is why the wise person is happy, whereas the unwise person is not. He wasn't the first Stoic to emphasize this, but he was very influential in developing this idea further. He also had something to say about anger, and Pliny asked his uncle, the philosopher Pliny the Elder, what he should do about it. And Pliny the Elder replied that he should respond with anger. He wanted people to be placid and calm and not easily excited. He also had some thoughts on friendship, and in one letter, Pliny the Younger writes that Heraclides advised him to choose his friends carefully. It seems that Heraclides thought that people can pretend to be friends when really they just want something from you. So be careful about that. Finally, we have Heraclides' views on death. He believed that death is not something to be feared. This is an idea that appears throughout the history of Stoicism, from the earliest Stoics all the way to the late Stoics. Overall, Heraclides of Tarsus was a very influential Stoic. Cicero was one of his students, as was Panaetius. What did you find most interesting about Heraclides of Tarsus? Let me know in the comments. I'm the host.